Cheatham, and today I'm having a conversation with Eric Kimberling, our CEO and founder here at Third Stage Consulting Group, about what is digital strategy. So I'd like to just start by asking you, why is a digital strategy important for a company? Just basic.
Well, the basic thing is that, every company is different. Every company has a different corporate or business organizational strategy. And their digital strategy needs to reflect that difference. And I think a lot of times organizations get caught up in a sort of a cookie cutter approach to digital transformation, where they think they can just go buy off the shelf software, implement it, and they're going to be golden. But the key is that, organizations that are the most successful are the ones that have a clear vision of how their digital transformation is going to enable their broader corporate goals and objectives. And that strategy is aligned with those goals and objectives. The other part of why digital strategy is so important too is from an alignment perspective, just making sure that you are, what's the word I'm looking for? Making sure that you're exploring your options and you understand the trade-offs and the pros and cons of your different options, because every organization has a multitude of options as far as what strategic direction they want to go with their digital transformation. There's a lot of decisions that need to be made, and you could certainly make those decisions in a vacuum or with a very limited group of involvement or a limited group of people being involved in those decisions. But the ones that are more successful are the ones that actually work through that process as a leadership team, define what the pros and cons are, and ultimately align on what the best path forward is for their particular situation. So it's important from a clarity perspective, making sure that you have the right strategy to support your overall corporate strategy, but also it's important from an alignment perspective to make sure that you understand, what the pros and cons and risks and options are across the board, and then ultimately aligning on that path forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. And knowing in today's climate in 2021, where businesses are very technologically based, where does a digital strategy fit within an overarching business strategy?
Well, I think for the more innovative organizations in the world, it's a part of the digital strategy is part of their business strategy. And there's a lot of investment and time and resources in defining that strategy and incorporating it into the overall business strategy. But, a lot of organizations may create a digital strategy after the fact, and that's okay too. I mean, if you have a clear business strategy of what you want to accomplish in terms of growth or profitability, customer experience, or, what you want to do with your supply chain longer term, if you have a clear vision of those things, then it's not easy, but it's easier to then define a digital strategy that can enable those different levers that you're trying to pull strategically.
Gotcha. And I know that digital transformation in relates to digital strategy can help optimize operations or business process management. How does a digital strategy translate to an operational strategy?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it gets back to the concept of digital strategy focusing on people, process, and technology. Those are sort of the three commonly referred to themes or buckets that need to be defined as part of a digital strategy. So what you're referring to in the operational strategy is obviously the people side of things, and the process side of things, and defining what those future state processes are going to be, which also feeds into or provides an input into the organizational or people side of things. So once we know what the future state operational model is and what our business processes are going to look like, that's going to influence how our organization is going to look and how we're going to organize ourselves or reorganize ourselves, how we're going to define roles and responsibilities, what the impacts to the organization are going to be. All that change management stuff is enabled by that understanding of that future state operating model or the process side of the equation.
That makes sense. And so what, in your opinion, comes first, digital strategy or digital transformation?
Digital strategy for sure, because you don't know what your digital transformation is, or you don't really know, I should say. Some people think they do, but you don't really know what your digital transformation is until you have defined your digital strategy. And by digital strategy too, by the way, it's not just, I know we'll get to later, other parts of the book, we'll get to what is digital strategy, what are the different components, but, in that digital strategy, you should be outlining, some fairly specific types of strategies, not just something like we need to replace all our systems. Okay, that's a really super high level strategy that doesn't really give you a whole lot to work with. But instead, what a digital strategy should define is, how are we going to improve our processes? How are we going to improve technologies? What types of technology are our priorities? Where are we going to focus our technological efforts? What's the cost benefit? What's the impact of the organization? How are we going to transition the organization? All those pieces need to be part of a digital strategy. Did that answer your question? I feel like I might have gone off track a little bit there.
Yeah, no. So I think we're talking about the strategy leading the transformation, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and to dig in that, I think a lot of our audience and our readers, they don't always correlate the word digital, with the people side of the business. Can you talk a little bit about why that would be constituted as digital strategy?
Yeah, that's a good point of clarification, because I think, in my personal opinion, is digital transformation is a misleading term. We use it just because it's so commonly accepted, and it's a nomenclature that people, can, maybe they don't fully understand it, but they can relate to it, and they sort of know what it means. But I think a true digital transformation, I think you focus on the word transformation. I mean, to me, that's the word we should be focused on. The digital stuff, yeah, there's technology that's going to enable the transformation, but to your point, it doesn't allude to, or it doesn't clarify the fact that it's also about people and operational changes too. So a digital transformation and a digital transformation strategy is entirely incomplete if you don't have a really clear roadmap for how your processes are going to change, and also how your organization is going to change, and how you're going to navigate those changes operationally and organizationally. Technology sort of comes up behind that as an enabler, but it's not. Technology typically is not, or should not be, the thing leading the charge for the overall transformation.
Excellent. And when should companies make a digital strategy?
Well, ideally before you start the transformation. I mean, a lot of times we get involved with clients where they've already started their transformation, and then you find that they don't have a clearly defined strategy, and that's part of their problem, is they don't have a clear vision, a clear path, a clear roadmap. They just went out and picked some software, some ERP software, whatever it is, and they started implementing stuff. Well, if you don't have a clear vision of what you want to be when you grow up and where you're headed as an organization, that transformation is going to get off track. Decision making is going to be super difficult during the implementation, because you're not going to have that sort of guiding light, or that North Star, or whatever you want to call it, that's leading you and giving you direction on where you should be headed. With technology today, the good news is there's just so many different options and variations and ways you can deploy technologies, and different types of technologies you can deploy, that it can be overwhelming. And you want a clear digital strategy will allow you to eliminate the noise and give you a clear focus and direction. So you're focusing your time and resources and money on the right things, and not wasting your time going down rabbit holes that have nothing to do with your strategy. So digital strategy really should be the horse before the cart, rather than the cart before the horse, which is what a lot of companies do, is they go out, pick technology, halfway through the implementation, realize that they don't have a clear strategy and need to sort of reset the project or redirect. So if you have that clear digital strategy up front, it's just going to save you a lot of time and money longer term, even though it may feel like you're taking too much time thinking and planning and setting the course. It may feel like you're wasting time, or that it's going to elongate the project, but in actuality, it's going to speed things up considerably when you look at the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important miss that we see a lot of times with our clients or our partners that we work with. Knowing that, who should lead a digital transformation or a digital strategy development?
That's a good question. I think it's no one person. You may have one person, like your CIO is oftentimes the person that will initiate the need for a digital strategy or for an overall digital transformation. But ultimately, the CIO, and no one person on your executive team, should be the person leading the project, or the only person leading the project. You really need the entire leadership team to be fully committed and involved in the transformation, because again, it's not a digital transformation. It's not really a digital transformation. It's a business transformation or just a transformation.
Mhm.
Technology is one important piece. That digital piece that your CIO would need to support is very important, but you also need your COO and your head of HR, your CEO, your CFO. All those people and all the people below them need to be involved in defining and executing that strategy, because it is going to affect the entire organization in some way.
Yeah, so it sounds like based off what you're saying, that alignment within that executive team is really pivotal before you can activate the strategy. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's kind of dig into what happens if you don't have a digital strategy. I know you kind of touched on it, but what can happen to a business if they invest in a technology, invest in a software system with no clear digital strategy? In your experience, what often happens in that project, or what's the end result?
Well, let's see. In no particular order, we might have to go back and prioritize this for the book, but in no particular order, I'd say one is that you don't have alignment as a team. It's almost impossible to have alignment as an organization without having a clear digital strategy, because what ends up happening is you get a collective group of people that work for your team, and then you also have outside vendors and consultants that are coming in with their own ideas, and everyone's got their own agenda, their own view of how things should be. And when there's no digital strategy, and again, using that North Star analogy, there's no digital strategy, there's no North Star. We don't know where we're going. We're just a group of people we're just going to start walking. We don't know what direction to go. We're just going to go wherever the wind takes us. And that may or may not be the right answer. Chances are very high it's not the right answer or the right fit. So that level of alignment is important, and getting everyone aligned and marching in the same direction. And also, so that's one piece. You don't have alignment as a team or as an organization. Maybe a second thing within that is that you don't have clear project governance during the transformation itself. When you have a clear digital strategy, that sets the parameters for how you make decisions. Should we spend extra time and money on adding this new module or rolling out this technology to additional people within the organization? That should be a relatively easy answer if we have a clear digital strategy. If it supports our digital strategy, maybe we do it. If not, then we don't. And if we don't have a clear digital strategy, the vendor is probably going to pressure us or convince us that we should just implement new technology because they make more money off of it. So it's a good way to give us project governance as a second thing. And maybe a secondary thing within that second thing is that it also gives us a mechanism within that governance to manage our vendors and our consultants, so that we can give them direction on how this is going to enable our business objectives. And then there's also the business value piece of it, which I'd say is a third thing. If you don't have a clear digital strategy, you're not going to get the business value out of the investment you're making. And companies that go through digital transformations are spending a lot of time and money and stress and chaos on the project. And you want to know that when you go through that, you're getting business value on the other side. And companies that don't have a clear digital strategy oftentimes meander through the project. They spend way too much time and money on the project. Then they get to the other side and find that they're no better off than they were before they embarked on the transformation. So those are probably the biggest ones I can think of. I'd say the other one is, from a change management perspective, it's a lot less chaotic, and it's a lot less of a negative impact to your employee morale, employee experience to have a clear digital strategy, because decision making becomes more clear. The project isn't as chaotic. People know what they're working towards. They're not getting overly influenced by outside software vendors, consultants trying to convince them to go a different direction because it benefits them. There's a lot of benefit organizationally as well that's probably a bit more intangible, but it's a very real negative effect when you don't have that clear strategy.
Certainly, it sounds like there's different tiers that can have a really high impact at a high volume, and then some that may be slower to have an impact, but it might be greater to the overall ROI of the business. And so what we hear digital transformation failures a lot in the industry. Can you explain to us what that means?
Yeah, there's no universal definition of what a failure is in the transformation space, But in general, I would define digital transformation as a project that cost considerably more money and time than expected and delivered considerably less business value than expected. And unfortunately, most organizations fall into that category. They either spend way too much time and money on the implementation or they don't get the value out of the implementation. And quite frankly, many of those organizations are the same as, or maybe even less better off than they were before the implementation. Not just because they just spent a huge amount of time and money on it, but also because they just didn't improve the operations. They didn't improve the organization. They're strategically and operationally and organizationally no better off than they were before. So, that's the way I would define it, as the ones that spend materially more time and money on the implementation itself, and they fail to get the business benefits they expect. And I guess the third thing, a really important one, third dimension of failure is operational disruption. Mm-hmm. So not only are they not getting the business value, which is one problem, but then there's the third thing in this whole thing is the operational disruption. And our research has shown that just over half of organizations that go through digital transformations have some sort of material operational disruption after they've converted their systems and their processes over to the new environment. And what I mean by that is not just it was a little bit more difficult than usual sort of thing, but more, we couldn't ship product. We couldn't close the books. We couldn't get a handle on what our inventory levels were. We were losing customer orders. Those material disruptions have a huge impact on transformations. And actually those operational disruptions are typically more costly than the first two failure points I described. Spending too much time and money on the implementation, not getting the business value. Just the operational disruption alone can cost, it can dwarf the cost of the other things we talked about.
Absolutely. And to unpack that a little bit, would you mind giving us an example of some of the work that you've done with clients that have been lacking on the digital strategy side, that went through a transformation and either experienced failure or struggled with it?
Yeah. So oftentimes what you find is sort of a mixed bag. You have, when you have a transformation that's in flight already or in progress, you'll find that there's some stuff that the organization is intuitively or coincidentally doing right, and it's aligned with where they should be going, and it kind of fits their model. But then there's a lot of things that they're not doing that are totally misaligned with what they're trying to accomplish as an organization, or they're just being inefficient. They're wasting time and money on things that don't matter. They're overspending on technology. They're overspending on system integrators and implementers, whatever the case may be. So what we end up doing is we end up prioritizing, knowing that you're already downstream a certain amount of time, or to a certain degree. It's not typically a good idea to just scrap it and start all over again. Typically you have some good, there's some nuggets of goodness in that whole mess that you might be experiencing. You want to preserve those and build on those and remediate some of the problems. So usually what we do is we say, okay, here are the critical things you absolutely have to fix if you want to have any chance of succeeding. And that's sort of like your first priority, or your first layer of priority. And then the next tier of priority would be, the things that you should probably do if you want to really maximize value and minimize and optimize the cost and investment you're making in the project. And then there's the third tier, which is more sort of your nice to have stuff. If you really want to fine tune it and really knock it out of the park, you want to get to these things. So you kind of work your way down that priority list and pivot on your strategy midstream. Oftentimes, that's oftentimes what happens. Sometimes though, clients are so far off the path of where they should be that it actually is helpful to just call a timeout on the project completely. And they're extreme cases, but sometimes they're warranted, because it's just, you're throwing good money after bad, and you're heading down a completely wrong path. It may be that general technology stack or process improvements that you had in mind are still relevant, but you've just gotten off track from that. So now we need to call a timeout because you're wasting way too much time and money, and let's sort of do a more of a 180 on the direction we're going. May not mean starting over from scratch, but it certainly means, there's some heavier remediation that might need to happen there. So there's really two kinds of clients that we work with in those cases where, it depends on how severe the problem is or how far off track they are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great information. Let's take a real world example of a high profile digital transformation failure and kind of talk about where that might have gone wrong for our audience here. So, can you give us a top line summary of what happened with the Nike digital transformation?
This one, yeah, they went with one of the, top tier ERP vendors. They spent $400 million, and that's $400 million on its ERP implementation, which is a huge number for even a company the size of Nike. I mean, that's just massive. By comparison, I don't have this metric I don't have Nike's revenue in front of me, but by comparison, we find that the average organization, and this is just the average company, not the average company that does it right, but just across the board, the average company spends somewhere between 3 and 4% of their annual revenue on the total implementation. So I'm pretty sure, that 400 million is a lot more than 2 to 3% of Nike's revenue, but I don't know how many billions of revenue they do. So then, what ended up happening after they got through the initial, through this $400 million investment, is that they couldn't forecast demand accurately at all. They couldn't get the right inventory mix or the right product mix to their customers, which in the retail and consumer product space, that's extremely important, is understanding your customers and where the demand's coming from and anticipating that demand so that you can produce enough product, especially in Nike's case, where, they're producing most of their products overseas, in China for most, for a lot of the world, they're producing overseas. So that lead time on products is important to get the demand right so they can back into when they need to get the products. And then, so what ended up happening though, that was really surprising is you expect that you spend $400 million on an implementation, you're going to see an ROI or some sort of business case that justifies that. And what ended up happening is they actually had negative benefits. They lost $100 million that they attributed to their implementation. So there's $100 million in revenue that they say they lost as a result of that failed implementation. And then when they announced this, their stock price decreased 20%. So right there, those two metrics that suggest there was actually a negative ROI, which is the exact opposite of what you would want. You would expect to see something like they gained $100 million of annual savings, and that therefore could justify somehow that $400 million investment potentially. But instead, they lost $100 million and then lost 20% of the sales price. And then they spent a lot more money and time just trying to get the technology to work correctly. I don't know how much more time and money they spent based on public information that's out there, but that was sort of the end result of that implementation or the net effect of that failure.
Yeah. So I think in conclusion, digital transformations can have a huge impact in both global companies and small businesses. So really, if you're not aligned on your digital strategy, then going through a transformation is a huge risk. Correct? That's kind of the moral of the story here.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you're basing it, it's like playing the lottery. You're buying you're getting a lottery ticket, and you're assuming or hoping that you've got the winning ticket. And the reality is the odds are stacked against you when you don't have that digital strategy, and the likelihood of you losing or not recouping that investment is extremely high without a proper digital strategy.
Absolutely. So throughout this series, we are going to discuss and dig into a lot more when it comes to how you can make sure your digital strategy is optimized for success as well, and going to some key best practices. But this is basically the overview section of some of the highlights of our introduction chapter for Eric's new book.